My name is Barry Loveland, and I'm here with Greg, who's our videographer today, and we're here on behalf of the LGBT Center of Central Pennsylvania History Project. Today is September 21st, 2016, and we're here for an oral history interview with Anthony Silvestre. And this interview is taking place at the Pitt Men's Health Study Clinic in Pittsburgh. Tony, do we have your permission to record the interview today?
Happily, yes.
Okay. And we have a consent form for you to see after and sign after the end of the interview.
Fine.
How does that look? Good? Okay, well, I want to start kind of at the beginning and get some basic background on where you were born, when you were born, and what life was like growing up.
Okay, well, I was born in 1946 in the Bronx, grew up there, spent my life there. Being in a sort of working class Italian urban neighborhood, I was very aware of stigma and some of the issues facing LGBT people. I identified myself as gay back in the 6th grade, so I went through high school knowing I was gay but not doing anything about it or talking to anybody about it. So I really got familiar with the closet and the woes and problems that arise from that closet, and I think that has somewhat informed my development since, and my interest in the gay movement since then.
And did you have brothers and sisters?
Yeah.
How about your parents? Did you come out to them at some point, or?
Only after I left town. And my one brother knew about my sexual orientation pretty much when I was in high school. But my two sisters, my other brother, we never talked about it till later, after I left town. I entered a religious community of brothers near Boston, the Holy Cross Brothers. And I spent 3 years there before I left. And my leaving was not related to my sexual orientation, at least as far as I can recall in terms of my conscious mind, but had more to do with my disillusionment with the church at the time. While I was there, I went to college, undergrad, and I finished my last year of undergrad at King's College in Wilkes-Barre. That's what brought me to Pennsylvania, so I could get my degree. And from there, I went to Penn State, and at Penn State, I was introduced to LGBT rights.
And how did that come about?
At that time, some students at Penn State tried to organize a gay group called the Homophiles at Penn State. And they had 4 people signing the papers to do that. 2 were openly heterosexual and 2 were gay. One of the gay people was also in ROTC. And he also was getting a degree in teaching and was doing, I guess, an internship or practicum in a school. And in the process of, so the group was sued. No, the group was not allowed to organize on campus, which was very unusual. And so the Homophiles at Penn State sued Penn State, and that got a lot of attention, and it gave a lot of attention to Joe, this teacher, potential teacher. And at that time, the Secretary of Education denied him a teacher's license based on moral turpitude or something, one of those clauses. And so that led to another suit and a whole bunch of organizing. And so the first thing I did was as an activist standing at a table collecting signatures on his behalf. And so that was and then I became active in the organization, Homophobes at Penn State.
Mm-hmm. About what year was that, do you recall?
That was early 70s.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And can you remember, in terms of like your sort of coming out process at Penn State, what that was like in terms of, you know, how was it about discovering other gay people and just your kind of experience going through that?
Yeah. Well, because of my association in the organization, I had a lot of opportunity to interact with people. So we organized a hotline, which is a very common way of starting in many rural areas. And so we had a lot of verbal interaction with people from Pennsylvania. And it didn't take much to get our address, so we were also doing written communication with people who themselves were coming out or who wanted information. We had a gay bar in State College. Actually, it was half a bar called the My Oh My. The entrance from College Avenue, the main drag, led down some steps into the bar. And then as you walked further into the bar and made a left, you walked into the straight end of the bar, where they usually had women dancing, in scanty clothed women dancing. And so it wouldn't be unusual for the Steelworkers Convention to have a bunch of their delegates watching the women, and of course on the gay side have a bunch of gay men and women. But things were touchy back then, so that we weren't allowed to dance in the bar, because that's where the society was. But as a result of having that organization and having the resources of the university, like free rooms and so on, meeting rooms, we became a natural place for crossroads for other activists going across the state. So we would bring speakers in from Philly or Pittsburgh. Many of our own members would graduate Penn State and go down to Philly or Pittsburgh and get active locally. So we really had already we were building networks with these other communities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. How long were you at Penn State?
Let's see, I was there, got my master's degree, and then was in a PhD program for a few years, probably about 5 or 6 years.
Mm-hmm. And that was from 1971 to what year did you start there?
Probably, I think I moved to Philly in 76.
Okay, so like 71 to 76, something in that range. Okay. And in terms of, I know that you got involved with the Pennsylvania Council. You got appointed to the Pennsylvania Council as the chair. How did that whole thing come about? How did you find out about what was going on in Harrisburg, and how did your name come up, I guess, as like someone that should be on the council?
Well, because I was president of HOPS, the Homophobes at Penn State, and because we were involved in some high-level lawsuits, I knew a lot of the activists in the state. And like I said, we invited them, Barbara Giddings to come speak. We invited Mark Siegel, Randy Forrester to come and speak at Penn State. For some reason, I was invited to a meeting in Harrisburg, and I can't recall the details of the invitation, but it was a meeting to deal with, to create an advisory committee or board on LGBT issues. And that's where I met Terry Delmuth, who was an aide to the governor, and Barry Kahn, who was an attorney with the Community Advocates Unit. And they really were driving forces behind the organization of the council. And so it was through my interactions at that meeting that I began to meet some of the people working at that state level.
Mm-hmm. And when you started attending those meetings, how did you? Well, did you? You said you knew some of the activists from around the state, but did you get to meet a lot more activists at that point?
Sure did. We had at that time more than a dozen groups in the state. All with a great variety in the level of sophistication, resources, and so on. Many of the leaders of those groups showed up for this meeting in Harrisburg. And in fact, out of this came a group called the Rural Gay Task Force.
Caucus. Rural Gay Caucus, I think.
Rural Gay Caucus.
Yeah.
And that was a very valuable forum for intrastate communication and resource sharing. So we had groups in Erie, Harrisburg, Allentown, Bethlehem, State College, Philly, Pittsburgh, and we would meet every other month, I think, in a different city, and work to develop initiatives, regional or statewide initiatives, supporting the development of changes in the human relations ordinances in the state, working to support some of the local groups by attending their events or providing resources at their events, going to each other's gay pride marches and so on.
And did you find it interesting to see all these people at this point and realize that the community is so extensive?
I think it was unusual. I don't know many parts of the country where there were regional or statewide organizations like we were developing. So it already was an unusual coming together of organizations. Our group was very diverse in every way, and I think there was therefore a lot of education that went on among members about the needs of different populations. So we learned about some of the problems of our older members dealing with nursing homes and assisted living facilities. Of course, our young people in schools and high schools and colleges. Some of the employment problems people had, relations with the police and state police and so on. So the caucus was a great source of information and communication, and as a result it educated all of us as to the kinds of issues that people were facing. And because we could come together, allowed for sort of a big brain trust to try to figure out how to move society along.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember any specific projects that you got involved with the caucus that were particularly interesting to you?
Well, one of them was a college professor. I think it might have been at a Pitt campus, actually, who, for some reason, the police entered his home and found some marijuana and also a copy of The Advocate. And so he was arrested. And as a result, he was also fired from the university, again using the moral turpitude clause. And he came to us and we took that case. And since Pitt was a state-related university at the time, and because we could stand on the shoulders of the State Department of Education, we were able to make our views widely known about the illegality of their action, especially as we interpreted they violated the governor's executive order, since he forbid discrimination in all state contracts, including with universities. Mm-hmm. And happily, the university backed down and he was restored, and I think received financial recompense for all of the legal costs and all of the annoyance and troubles that came as a result of their action. And so that was a very important lesson for us, that we could in fact be successful taking on major institutions and using the executive order as a vehicle for doing that.
Mm-hmm. And that was while you were on the council, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And what are your memories, kind of going back to just before the council was formed, what are your memories of your first meeting with Governor Schaap?
I met him at the governor's mansion. I was invited by Terry and Barry to meet with him, and it was for breakfast. So I remember we had breakfast together, and he was a very quiet-spoken man, intense man. And in our conversation, it became clear that he was very progressive in all of his views, all of his political views. He formed the first Women's Commission about that time, and was amenable, and probably by then had already agreed to form the council, on the urging of Terry and Barry. So I guess I was rather tongue-tied, college student sitting with the governor, and I don't recall what we talked about actually.
But shortly after that, I guess he appointed you to chair the council.
Council, yeah.
And then, what committees or specific issues did you get involved in with the council, and what progress was made during your involvement?
As chair, I was, of course, in a way responsible for all of the committees, and so a lot of my work was making sure that each committee was functioning appropriately and had resources, and reporting back to the whole council. At the time, I spent a good deal of energy making sure that the various state departments and agencies were represented on the council, so that we didn't have vacancies lasting too long, if someone retired or resigned. So I was usually, I might be called in by particular committees of the council if they felt they needed my intervention somehow in moving something along.
Did you find any particular agencies more problematic or difficult to get cooperation from than others?
I can't say that anyone stands out in particular. I mean, probably it's counterintuitive. One of the most cooperative agencies was the state police.
Really?
They met with us regularly, and anytime there were complaints that we received, basically relating to sexual activity at rest areas on the highway, the state police were very responsive to those. And They even allowed us to come in and help train their officers. So I have to say that was probably one of the more interesting things I did, was sit in with a bunch of brand new police officers, 10 or 15 in a room, talking about homosexuality. I have to say they were very respectful and seemed to respond in ways you would expect and hope that they would.
Did you get involved with the first lobby day that was held at the legislature?
Right, the Gay Lobby Day
Yeah.
in Harrisburg.
Yeah.
Yes, I was, not only helped organize it, of course, but I was there participating. And we often went, it suggested people go in groups of 2 or 3 for a lot of reasons. One certainly was so that we could make sure to bring up all the issues we were concerned about. So my partner that day was Spencer Cox, who was the head of the ACLU in Philadelphia. And Spencer was unrelenting in his support of LGBT people. And he was used to dealing with legislators just from his position, and they were used to him. And so it was very interesting to see the level of discussion he had. And it was also interesting for me to see that no matter how rural or conservative the district, the members of the legislature we talked to or their aides were always very responsive and supportive. I think by that time there was, a lot of movement in the country and even in the state in support of various commissions and issues related to feminism and even gay rights. So we didn't surprise them. They weren't surprised by us, and they seemed to be very receptive in what we had to discuss.
I know there was, shortly after Governor Shapp created the council, there was kind of like a number of bills that got introduced in the legislature that were kind of anti-gay, and there was a lot of activity kind of right around that time period, trying to push back against what he had done with the executive orders. Could you tell me a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, there was a state senator, Nolan, I believe, who was avidly unreasonable when it came to this issue. And he kept trying to pass legislation allowing or forbidding the employment of gay people in jobs working with youth, especially in the education field. And he was just outspoken in his position. And he tried to pass and inspired other legislators to introduce bills, so that we constantly had 3 or 4 bills going through the House or Senate. But indeed, they didn't seem to have much behind them. And in fact, at one point, he resigned his position in the Senate, and
so where we left off was Senator Dolan pushed out.
right.
If you could finish that thought.
Yeah. So Nolan at that time was, I think, majority leader in the Senate, and he and Shapp had many run-ins. So Shapp, of course, even in getting elected, sort of did so outside of the Democratic Party internal systems. He was sort of a maverick, and I don't know that he was actually the choice at the time to run for governor. I think the Democrats might have chosen someone else. So he wasn't one of the favorites. And so Nolan was already predisposed to be unhappy with Shap. And as a very strong, outspoken supporter of the Catholic Church, very anti-abortion, he sort of naturally found us to be a government organization that he did not want to approve and could not approve. And so he would write legislation often to disband, revoke the governor's executive order, or to create new legislation that would forbid hiring of people known to be gay in jobs working with children in particular. And so that remained a thorn in our side for a long time. Although he didn't get anywhere with his bills, except really to alienate the other legislators, because they found themselves getting lobbied both from our people and from the other side. And it put them in very uncomfortable positions to have to talk about these issues back in their hometowns, issues that they didn't really think were relevant, since there was nothing happening in the public that was generating all this legislation. It was just being self-generated from Nolan's office and from some of his allies. And so as a result, more and more pressure built so that he was voted out of his majority whip position, I believe, because he was devoting too much energy to this issue in particular, and it was becoming more and more difficult for his allies in the Democratic Party to have to declare themselves on this issue. It was one issue. The people were much happier just to turn away and not pay any attention to it. It was a no-win for them, in their view, no matter what they did.
Do you recall the first gay conference that was held in Harrisburg at the Friends Meeting House and State Museum?
Yes.
And maybe talk a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, we think that was very important. Already we had, as you know, the caucus, so we already had groups around the state, but the expertise of the leadership of those groups varied, and it became clear that we would benefit by having opportunities to get together, to bring in experts, and to hold brainstorming and planning sessions in some kind of conference-like setting. And so we created this conference and brought in people from the state as well as people from outside government who could help us develop our skills, whatever they might be, that we needed in order to work with the state. Understanding how budgets happened, understanding how services were developed or created in the state, in the bureaucracy. Talking about some of the issues that people were concerned about, STDs, for instance, adoption, foster care. So these were some of the issues that were on people's minds, dealing with police, dealing with employment discrimination. And by bringing in experts and educating large groups of activists at one time, it really equipped many of us with a lot of information that was useful in carrying out the everyday activities that we were involved in.
And do you recall you had people from all over the state attend, or?
Yes, we did. We had our membership always from the very beginning. It was pretty expansive. Usually there were groups in most of the cities in Pennsylvania, not only the major cities like Philly and Pittsburgh, but also maybe, as we might say, second tier in terms of population. Harrisburg, Erie, Allentown. And many of the people who were in those organizations often came from even less populated areas. So we had people who lived on country lanes, and we had people in towns that were just had a few thousand citizens. And so the issues facing our members were very varied because of the backgrounds, the places people lived. And a challenge, I think, to the activists at the time was to make sure we had enough resources to address the issues of this wide-ranged, very diverse population.
Do you recall how the idea of the governor doing a proclamation for Gay Pride Week came about?
Yeah, I think it might have come from one of his cabinet members. I was thinking about her this morning, and her name just escapes me. It was either Ethel or Esther. Ethel Allen, I believe. And I think she was secretary of, I was going to say commerce, but I'm not sure. I'd have to double check. And she's the one who asked the governor to make the proclamation. I'm not sure. I think she might have been asked to do so by activists from Philadelphia, since that was where she lived. And she was herself predisposed to support LGBT people. So I'm not surprised that she originated the request. And she was very well respected in the state, and I'm not surprised that the governor agreed to do so and did so. And the reaction was mixed. It caused a fury of backlash. We received dozens of letters from around the state condemning the governor for issuing the proclamation. Some people found it much easier to accept the notion that he supported civil rights, but not that he would support pride. It was sort of a new idea for many people, and many people saw it as a kind of proselytizing or a level of approval that they thought was not appropriate for a governor. In any case, we tried to counter that by generating letters in support, but it's a lot easier to get letters from people who are angry and opposed than it is from people who are supportive. So we never matched them letter for letter, but we did generate some dozens of letters in support of his position. It sort of brought him more national attention on this issue. There weren't too many popular politicians out there at that time doing this kind of work. He was one of the few politicians statewide, in the U.S., that I can recall who were so outspoken on this issue. Jerry Brown was certainly out there being supportive. A lot of the governors of East Coast, West Coast, San Francisco, LA, New York, even Philadelphia, were more used to being openly supportive of LGBT people. But it was very rare for a governor to be so outspoken. And It brought a lot of attention to the issue, and it helped us develop our own understanding of what the state could or could not do in terms of LGBT people. I don't think we ever really fully understood the potential for change that could be generated through state government. Most of the focus of the community at that time was on getting rid of sodomy laws and supporting federal efforts from GRNL, Gay Rights National Lobby, to get a statewide anti-discrimination bill passed. But not too many people, it was very unusual to look at other ways that one could change, bring about change. And SHAP gave us an opportunity to focus on county government and the counties as providers of services. And we did that in a couple places, both in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. There was movement in their children and youth agencies to support sensible placements for gay foster kids. And so there were attempts to find foster parents who would support these kids so that these kids could be placed in healthy environments. And this is important because there are thousands of children in the children's and youth services throughout Pennsylvania, many of whom were there because they were LGBT and maybe had come from homes which weren't accepting of them. So finding homes and support for these young people was very important. And it was SHAP's executive order which showed us how one could move county governments and therefore move county programs around jails, around children and youth services, around services for the aged, services for disabled populations. All of these services that served millions of people around the country could all be moved to better serve LGBT people in their populations. And so this became more and more evident to us as a council, and we began to do more and more outreach, even nationally, to the national gay political community to try to move people on these kinds of issues. And I have to say, even to this day, I don't think people appreciate the importance of moving the bureaucrats who run government services to include proper policies and programs for LGBT people. We still have most programs in this country operating with the assumption that their clients are straight people, whether it's nursing homes, whether it's hospitals, whether it's group homes for kids. Most of them run with the assumption that the people receiving these services are straight. And we know that's not true. And because of that assumption, these other populations, non-straight populations, are being shortchanged. They're not getting services that are culturally appropriate. So I think this was the major, probably the most significant finding or position that the council developed and tried to export as far as we could, even throughout Pennsylvania and then beyond Pennsylvania, outside the state. We were successful, I think, within the state in, as I said, in children and youth programming. We did have support for gay youth in Philly and Pittsburgh, and some of which that support is still there. When the Cuban Mariel boat lift was happening and Cubans were coming to Florida sort of on undocumented refugees coming to the shores of this country. Many of them ended up at the Camp Hill Center for Refugees. And there were a gaggle of young gay kids in that group. And we worked with the State Department of Education, I believe at that time, to help move those kids into programs in Philadelphia where they could find a group home that was secure, and also developed a high school for gay students so that these kids could have educational opportunities that we weren't finding available in Philadelphia public schools at the time. And again, I think that was very educational for us because our community, I don't think, has fully appreciated the power that county governments have. When people think about lobbying, they think about lobbying their state senator or congressman or governor, but don't often think about lobbying the county commissioners. But in fact, it's the county commissioners who often develop the agenda for the Democratic or Republican Party in their state. The county commissioners often have a lot to say about who becomes members of Congress and who becomes the nominees for the Senate, as well as the governor. And it's the county commissioners who hire and fire the various heads of health departments, welfare departments, and so on, wardens and jails. And so it's those county commissioners who really have a lot of authority and power to be able to move systems to be more accessible to LGBT people. And so that became, I guess, our clarion cry. And hopefully it's something that might still yet inspire people to pay more attention to county governments and county services because they affect our most vulnerable populations. Getting rid of the state sodomy law, which is something that happened in Pennsylvania that we did a little bit of support for. But even changing that very oppressive law was very, very important. It was essential. But its impact is hard to see because a lot of people weren't getting arrested. There weren't very many bar raids happening. But it really acted, I think, that law to encourage stigma and to provide an excuse to discriminate against gay people because they were breaking the law. They were lawbreakers in addition to being immoral. And so it sort of provided an atmosphere that allowed discrimination. But in terms of concrete benefits and pain, I believe that affecting the agencies that provide services to vulnerable people is probably more important than even changing laws because those agencies affect the life and death of so many vulnerable people and really can have tremendous impacts for good or bad.
You mentioned something about a alternative gay high school being set up that the refugees were able to attend. I wasn't aware of that. That's very interesting. Do you recall more about how that came to be?
Sure. The kids at that time were living in a group home in Philadelphia and going to school in Philadelphia. Some of the kids were cross-dressing on occasion or a lot and had difficulties, as you could well imagine, fitting into the schools. So there was bullying, there was all kinds of other issues, and attendance at school was very difficult to maintain. So luckily there was a man in the city, I think his first name was Joe Byton, who had a license, a school license, because he had run a private school in Massachusetts, I believe. And he maintained his credentials and licensure. And so he was able to use those to open this school and enrolled all of our young people in it. And we graduated a class. We had a graduation party for them. But of course, when the Airman Center closed, the school closed with it. We have to remember at that time, getting resources for services for LGBT people was not very easy. It was hard to get support, financial support from foundations and certainly from state agencies to support these kinds of programs.
It's interesting though that's something like that could happen that early.
It happened. It was very early. It was the first one in the country.
Yeah, the Harvey Milk School wasn't even in existence then in New York.
It was not.
Right?
No, that came later.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course, that's been more successful. It's been survived a long time.
Right, but that's pretty amazing that happened. You also, well, I remember from the program that we had with the council that one of the gentlemen was talking about the fact that through the work of the council, you were able to kind of embed so much more in terms of services and so forth, regulations and policy changes and everything with different departments. And I know you talked about the counties a lot. Were there other examples that you can recall that where some of those changes really became kind of institutionalized in the agencies?
Well, one major change that happened in the governor's office of administration was the requirement that every new state worker was trained on LGBT people and then later AIDS. And that requirement, especially as it came to AIDS, applied not only to new hires but to existing staff. And I like to think that that had a major impact in this state on the AIDS epidemic. Because we know nationally the federal government was very slow to react to the AIDS epidemic. Normally the CDC reacted within 3 or 6 months to any new disease or outbreak. Just look at avian flu or the Zika virus. There's almost immediate response. The feds go out immediately and start examining the problem and start trying to develop vaccines and other solutions. Well, this didn't happen with HIV. The first cases of HIV became identified in the late 70s, early 80s, and it wasn't until 86, 87 that the federal government began to even talk about the issue publicly. I think it was Reagan in 87 who mentioned the words for the first time, and it was his Surgeon General who produced the first and these were knowledge and information about this disease was very slow in coming, and many providers in the state had no idea what to do. So agencies, departments of education, for instance, local high schools, didn't know what policies they should support in terms of this disease. If someone was found to have the disease, should they be removed from school if they were students or teachers? These became very important issues affecting people every day. And so the governor's Office of Administration in requiring this education went a long way in allowing, I think, many institutions in Pennsylvania to develop in appropriate ways with this disease people were taught what kind of policies were useful. They were taught how the disease was transmitted, how it could be prevented, and so on and so on. It was a very major, I think, profoundly important effect of this, the Office of Administration.
How about the university system? How did it affect the employment practices and other aspects of the universities?
Well, certainly the many of the LGBT groups in the state at that time were organized around campus groups. It was probably the easiest way to set up an organization because you automatically got a room to meet. Sometimes you got a budget. You had ways of publicizing through the school newspapers and so on. So it became a very, and of course young people were always interested in becoming activists. This was the kids of the 60s and 70s. Activism was expected. And so the college campuses were often the place where organization happened, and often it was organizations led by students and faculty members. Many of the college organizations, by nature of their presence, were able to change the anti-discrimination statements of their universities or colleges so that sexual orientation was explicitly mentioned as a basis for non-discrimination. And again, it was those organizations often who could bring in speakers that would educate not only the university campuses but the community at large about LGBT issues. In some cases, universities were able to generate courses on LGBT issues and actually get other existing courses like health courses to focus on issues of particular importance to LGBT people, to pass AIDS policies at those universities and so on. So again, I don't think we can underestimate the importance of the impact that those groups had, and a lot of them were inspired by the Governor's Council. Many members of the council were themselves active in university groups or on faculty, and they were able to help generate activity through the Rural Gay Caucus as well as through the Governor's Council. We also got the State Department of Education to issue the kinds of protections in their own policies for gay students or gay faculty members.
How much interaction did you have with Governor Schaap or his staff during your involvement as the chair?
Well, my interaction with the governor during my term as chair was most often at social events, either activities that they had at the governor's mansion, like some kind of special activity put on by the Women's Commission, or simply by stopping in his office when I was in Harrisburg. And those were basically, most usually, just social interactions that we had. The substantial relationships in terms of policy or legislation those kinds of conversations happened through his aides, primarily Terry Delmuth and Barry Ayers. And I was in communication with them sometimes daily, certainly weekly, on trying to move the different state agencies forward one way or another. Our goal at that time was to embed this issue as deeply as we could in every state agency. So we were always looking for opportunities to add language, to add our language into their contracts and into their policies. And we were pretty successful. We had, at one point, all of the state agencies were required to notify us of any discrimination complaints that were issued in their agencies around LGBT issues. And that had a major effect in terms of letting people know that this was a serious issue, that these issues had to be recorded and that reports had to be generated if these complaints came in. And so bureaucrats know that when you have to generate a report, that business is serious. And so I think it had a lot of impact in that I think it made sort of gave notice that these kind of complaints were not welcome and that actions would be taken to remedy them. And so I think in some sense it really helped change the whole attitude of the bureaucracy. This was now becoming an issue that demanded attention, the same way that the Governor's Commission for Women, his Latino Council, and other programs that he supported. He was very much outstanding supporter of equal rights and civil rights for all minorities. He was just probably one of the most activist governors in the country in that way. And it became clear to people that LGBT people were to be included under that umbrella.
How long did the council exist?
Well, it was created by Schaap, and to my knowledge, it's not been discreated, so one might say it continues. Under Governor Thornburg, the council became inactive. I wasn't able to get administrative support for keeping the council going. So it became impossible to get a room for our meeting or to get mailings sent out. And so basically we just dwindled away. At the same time what was happening, however, the state was responding to AIDS. And clearly a major part of the governor's attention as it affected gay people was focused on moving the AIDS agenda forward. So one of his major aides, Maria Keating, was very busy working with council members to write the state's policy for the education department on AIDS in schools and to write policies for that Department of Health and Department of Welfare. So as the state and activists increasingly turned towards AIDS, we turned away from LGBT activism per se.
Okay. How much do you think the LGBT community at large at the time was aware of Governor Schaap's initiatives and what significance it had in the community?
I think at that time, and I think even now, most LGBT people don't appreciate or understand the importance of county government and county programs. When you talk about governments and discrimination, people think of that in terms of employment discrimination or housing discrimination, being fired from a job, being evicted from a house. And these are true things that happen. But few people think about the fact that we might have programs in our schools to help young people stop smoking tobacco, but those programs are not designed to reach LGBT people. Those programs need to be redesigned in order to reach that population if they want to be successful. And one could go down the, we know that there's evidence that of all groups in society, African American lesbians probably get health care the least of any population. For lots of reasons, economic, race-related reasons, they're less likely to see a doctor than other populations. And so when we're doing programs for women's health, are we developing programs that will outreach to and successfully work with black lesbians? And I have to say the answer is probably no. Are we finding those women? Are we bringing them in? Are we hiring them to work in those programs? And if we can't say yes to those questions, then we're probably not providing the services in a culturally competent way. And I don't think that's been understood in the past, and I really feel like it's not understood even now. That even now, most county programs, health and welfare programs, are still assuming heterosexuality of all their patients or clients. And so there's still a cost being paid because of that neglect.
I want to turn back to kind of your occupational history to kind of catch up with all this time period. And you said after Penn State you moved to Philadelphia.
Right.
What were you doing in Philadelphia?
At that time I became executive or administrator, I think it was called, of the Airmen Center. Airmen was ERO, erotic, MIN, minorities. And it was a center that was established for exactly what I've been talking about. It was set up to provide culturally competent mental health services. At that time, the common experience of people who went to mental health counseling services at either, especially at county-supported mental health centers, was that when they went in, no matter what their presenting problem was, whether it was, say, depression or relationship problems, those are the two problems that most commonly were brought as the primary presenting problem. But no matter what the presenting problem was, the therapist ended up wanting to treat homosexuality. So it was only in the 70s that the APA removed homosexuality as a mental illness. And a lot of therapists were conditioned to look at homosexuals as people suffering from mental health problems. And so many of our clients at Airmen who were trying to deal with alcoholism or depression couldn't find competent professionals. So what the center did was gathered volunteer therapists who came and each had a client load of maybe 3 or 5 clients that they saw every week and provided free counseling to. And I think part of that experience helped me understand what happens when you assume the heterosexuality of your patients. Basically, you're denying them service in a roundabout way. And I think that probably helped sharpen my awareness of the need for culturally competent health and welfare services.
And how many years were you involved with that?
So I was there for about 5 years. The agency finally went under, unfortunately. Again, without any support, institutional support, financial support from government, keeping such agencies sustained was very, very difficult. The only agency like it in the state was at Pittsburgh, the Persad Center, which happily continues till today. But without government support, it was very difficult. Although we didn't pay our therapists, certainly we had to pay rent, and we had to pay staff to keep the organization functioning. And although it was a small budget, primarily the money had to be raised through fundraising. And at that time, fundraising was not something that people expected to participate in. Unlike since those days, of course, now with the advent of AIDS, unfortunately, people have understood the importance of raising money to support activities in the community. But at that time, fundraising was sort of a new idea in the LGBT community. And it was very rare. It was very difficult to get successful monies raised through foundations or through donation. And so the agency finally crashed.
And then what did you do from there?
That's when I was hired here at the University of Pittsburgh at the Pitt Men's Study. Dr. Ronaldo, who was investigator of that study for NIH, had to recruit a few thousand gay men into his study. And so they had to find somebody who could do that recruitment. And for some reason or other, my plans for how to do that impressed them enough that they offered me a 6-month position. And 30 plus years later, I'm still sitting in the office.
Very good.
And my work, interestingly, I was able to use that position to interact with the county and state people. I continue to do so, to try to use AIDS as the hook to bring people to the understanding of their need to establish programs that are LGBT specific and to develop the skills to do that. And so I feel like in some ways I'm doing the same work but sitting on a different desk doing it.
And talk a little bit more about your work here at the Pittman's study. Yes.
If we stop it now, it's going to break in 1 minute.
Okay.
Maybe we can
Yeah,
finish
let's
that
start
question.
again.
So I used a so-called social marketing strategy in order to recruit men into the study. The benefit to the men was that they got an HIV test and that they could, from that, the minute after that test, get introduced to a clinic for treatment. So we were able to do lots of important programming work. We could do prevention. So we went into bars and actually drew blood in bars, and were able at those occasions to get people to agree to come back to our office and get theirs. Eventually, it was the summer of '84 when there was an HIV test that finally worked. And I remember that summer because it was during that summer we had to tell about 300 men that they had this virus and that they probably were going to die within 3 years. So it was very difficult work, but I think we were supported certainly by Dr. Ronaldo and by our staff to do a lot to lessen the impact of that bad news by helping create support groups, by helping the existing agencies provide services. So one of the things that we did in terms of our organization was to create a community advisory board. It's probably one of the first in the country dealing with HIV. And that community advisory board had some of the most popular gay bar owners and gay bartenders. It had the head of MCC, Metropolitan Community Church. It had other well-known celebrities in the gay community. And so these people helped us fashion the marketing. They helped us get into the bars. They gave us an opportunity to do a training session for all bartenders about AIDS, so that those bartenders could themselves act as educators in the bars. We were able to develop even cocktail napkins that had information about AIDS that the bartenders would give out. We also supported Perkside Center in supporting its mental health work with people who were infected. And we also, our board created the Pittsburgh AIDS Task Force, which to this day is the paramount group in the city, the county, providing AIDS services. And we also worked to organize a statewide AIDS consortium that was able to began to lobby the state for more funding for AIDS and HIV, and actually had some success with Dornberg and Casey in moving forward intelligent policies and beginning funding. So in some ways, the Pittman study and the work it's done statewide has had an ongoing influence in terms of the provision of services in Pennsylvania. And we continue to do that. Right now, the focus of our community board is on the impact of HIV and aging. As more of our men with HIV go into assisted living or nursing homes, we're finding that those agencies are ill-equipped. That often the doctors that run those, provide services in the nursing homes, are themselves not necessarily well educated about HIV. And the staff in those homes are also not well educated. Having someone with AIDS entering one of those agencies could be, from the agency's point of view, very disruptive. Family members of other people living in those nursing homes could become concerned about transmission to their own relatives. Staff in those nursing homes could become, because they're uninformed about proper procedures to avoid infectious waste, will themselves often have reservations about accepting people with AIDS. And so we're finding that there's going to be a whole transition probably for a few years, so that these agencies will be able to meet the needs of people with AIDS as they require home health care or nursing home care.
How about if we go back a little bit to, you mentioned that you had entered a sort of religious community at one point, and then you got disillusioned. I assume you're maybe not affiliated with any particular religion now, or are you back to having some affiliation?
Right now I am a practicing Buddhist.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. And when did that happen?
Well, it began happening in the early 90s and then got deeper and deeper over time.
Wow.
And right now I run a center on mindful meditation that we have here at the university.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
And in fact, one of the things we're thinking about doing is offering mindful meditation to people with AIDS, because we know that mindful meditation can increase the effectiveness of the immune system.
Oh, that's pretty amazing. Is there much of an LGBT presence in the Buddhist community that you're aware of, or?
Yeah, there seem to be. We don't have any shortage
Mm-hmm.
of LGBT people. In fact, one of the major we had the Dalai Lama come to Pittsburgh in the 90s, and the people who organized that were leaders in the LGBT community who were also Buddhist.
Wow.
And there's leadership of some of our groups in town, or gay men and lesbians, some of the other Buddhist groups. And there are certainly openly gay people in just about every group in town.
Interesting. And in terms of your, well, you were not involved in the military, I assume. That didn't come up, so I assume that's correct.
No, I was a conscientious objector,
Mhm.
and I did alternative service in a children's institution. So I worked with pre-adolescent young men, boys. And I think it was in that work too I got to understand the power of the children and youth agencies and the profound impact they could have on young people. And I also got to understand how the gay kids in that system can often be victimized either by overt behavior or certainly by silence. When they weren't being bullied by other kids, they were being, their sexuality was being ignored by the counseling staff and others who really could have been playing a much more proactive supporting role if the institution was responsive.
Anything else about sort of your organizational affiliation history? You know, what kind of groups have you been involved with over the years?
Well, I've certainly been involved, again, with the Community Advisory Board with a lot of organizational development in Pittsburgh. So we've helped organize a group, Asians and Friends. We certainly have been supportive of the student gay groups and staff groups here at the university. We helped to organize, I was involved in organizing the Rainbow Buddhists, which was a group of LGBT Buddhists. And part of my working career is helping the state facilitate its HIV planning group. And so that group gives advice to the state on how to develop its plan for HIV care and prevention. And so some of the things we've done, I think the most important things we've done in the last few years was organizing HIV services through the Ball community by supporting SILK, which is a group for African American young MSM and trans kids who are members of the Ball community. And we've also been involved in an anti-stigma campaign where we've had billboards and bus signs throughout the city telling the stories of heterosexuals who have gay people in their families. So we might have a bulletin board which shows a picture of a father and his gay son, or a mother and her gay son, or somebody had a gay sibling, and so on. And we've organized at libraries and other places groups to discuss, at churches, groups to discuss these stories. So basically, we get someone to tell their true story of being supportive of a gay person, and then we create those into cards with a picture on one side and the story on the other side. And then we use those in group discussions at gay churches or other places, or minority churches in particular. The program is mostly aimed at social acceptance within the minority community, African American community. And so we use whatever venues we can to bring people from that community together to discuss these scenarios. The notion is that people are most likely to change when someone they know is gay or lesbian. And so we try to bring up this notion that someone in your family probably is, and allow people to have that opportunity to think about that and to see how other people in the group respond and so on.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the ball community. I'm not too familiar with that term, so maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, the ball community are, there's a whole community of young black MSM and trans kids who do drag shows.
Okay.
And have competitions. So competition might be the most glamorous, or who would win the most. Sometimes you have people doing, being asked to dress their future as their future self. So you might have one of the kids dressing as a female astronaut or some other interesting occupation. And they win prizes based on these shows that they have, these competitions, which also usually require some kind of dancing and can be pretty demanding. And prizes are given to the winners of the show. So we've supported those, and we've created a center in downtown Pittsburgh where these kids get to meet, and they spend their time there organizing for the show, which might mean that they're making wigs or they're doing some sewing or sequins, because sequins are very popular in these shows. And but even at this event, while they're there, they have opportunities to meet in private with people who can provide them with services if they need housing, if they need a high school diploma, if they need an HIV test, if they need hormones. Those services could be and are organized and available.
Good.
So it's a very underserved population. But we work with a lot of county agencies, and again, getting the counties agencies to buy into their obligation to meet the needs of these kids is important. So we could take one of these kids and walk them over from our center right into free housing, and give them food stamps, all within 24 hours. So it's very fast turnover.
That's great. Turning a little bit more to your personal life, I know you have a longtime partner. Is he the first long-term partner you've had, or did you have previous partners? Or?
I've had previous partners.
When did you first meet your first partner, for example?
I think it was about 1970, 71, and
This was at Penn State or before Penn State, or?
This was while I was at Penn State.
Penn State.
And in fact, he moved to Penn State, and we were together for I think about 10 years. And then we separated, he moved away, and I met my second partner at Penn State, and he moved down to Philadelphia with me, and we lived together there for a number of years. And then we separated, and eventually he passed away. And I met Michael through a Buddhist dating service online, and we've been together since. It's only been about 6 years now.
Okay.
Then we actually got married.
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah. It was something that my tax accountant explained the benefits of, and so for very unromantic reasons, we self-married. In Pennsylvania, the Quakers, who don't cotton to making oaths to government, got legislation passed where they could marry each other without the need of an officiant.
Wow.
And so in Pennsylvania, you can self-marry and just get 2 people to witness it, and that's it, it's done and over with.
Mm.
And so we did that at a Buddhist retreat.
And in terms of your family members, have they all kind of come to accept your relationship? And
Yeah, and I have to say even more than that. My older sister, who's in her 80s, is quick to argue with some of the other old lady friends she has about LGBT issues.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they're not only supportive of me, but they've become pretty much advocates.
Mm-hmm. Great. Are there anything else that you can think of that we've missed talking about that you'd like to mention?
I guess the only thing I would like to say is that all of these things that I've talked about, or any of the progress we've made, has really been due to the efforts of lots and lots of people. That I could, in very few minutes, come up with a list of 100 people who made all these things happen. So that someone like me just happened to be maybe there, maybe the face of a lot of this work. But that the activism in this state was was generated by lots of interesting and heroic people. I know activists in Pennsylvania who've been shot at, who've been threatened, who've been attacked one way or another, who've been pressured by their employers and so on. But even in the face of that, have stood up and kept being active with not much reward, even from within the community. I remember vividly early on in the days of being told more than once to stop rocking the boat. You know, gay people were afraid that if we rocked the boat too much, they would become visible and therefore begin suffering consequences of stigma. And so being a gay activist didn't mean that you made friends with a lot of gay people. Sometimes people avoided you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and all of your memories. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I hope that you've found it to be a useful thing as well.
I did, thank you.
Good.
Happy to do it.
Thank you.
Mhm.